The morning she walked into his garage, Garrett had grease on his hands, and a court notice on his workbench that he hadn't opened yet. He'd been putting it off for 3 days. The envelope sat there between a socket wrench and an empty coffee mug, and every time he looked at it, he found something else that needed doing first. A carburetor that needed cleaning. A brake line that wouldn't wait. A daughter who needed her lunch packed before the bus came. The envelope could wait. The envelope had been waiting since Tuesday. He was underneath a '68 Mustang when he heard the tires on the gravel. Slow, cautious tires, someone who wasn't sure this was the right place. He'd heard that particular sound before, usually from customers who'd typed auto restoration Keller Falls into their phone and expected something more official looking than a converted barn off Route 9 with a hand-painted sign that said Ward Mechanics above the door. He slid out from under the car. The vehicle idling in his driveway was a Bentley Continental. Dark navy, current year, the kind of car that cost more than his house. Not typical for Keller Falls. Not typical for anywhere within 40 miles of Keller Falls. The woman who stepped out of it was wearing clothes that probably cost more than the car. She looked at the barn. She looked at the sign. She looked at Garrett, still on the floor, socket wrench in hand, grease to his elbows, and she said, "Are you the one who restored the Chandler Estate's old roadster?" He sat up slowly. "Who's asking?" "Someone whose car has a problem no one in the city can seem to fix." She looked past him into the garage, at the Mustang on the lift, at the wall of tools arranged in a way that had taken him 11 years to get exactly right. "My name is Vivienne Ashworth." He recognized the name the way you recognize weather before it arrives. Ashworth Innovations had broken ground on a research campus 15 miles east the previous spring. There'd been a piece in the regional paper. Local jobs, local investment, that sort of thing. He hadn't paid much attention. He had his own things to pay attention to. "Garrett Ward," he said. He didn't offer his hand. He was covered in grease, and she looked like she'd never touched anything dirty in her life. "What's wrong with the Bentley?" "It's not the Bentley." She turned back to the road, and only then did he notice the second car. A flatbed, backing slowly up his gravel drive, carrying on its bed something under a canvas tarp. "It's that." The tarp came off to reveal a 1971 Porsche 911S. Guards red, or what had once been Guards red. The paint was oxidized to something closer to brick dust. The rear bumper was gone. Both front quarter panels had rust blooms that told a long story about bad storage and worse luck. The windshield had a crack running the full width that someone had tried to stop with what appeared to be hardware store epoxy. It was, objectively, a wreck. Garrett walked around it once without saying anything. "My grandfather bought it new," Vivienne said from behind him. "He drove it for about 6 years, then stored it when my grandmother said it was impractical. That was 1977. It's been in a barn in Connecticut ever since. How long have you had it?" "Since he passed. 8 months ago." She paused. "He left it to me specifically. Not to my father, not to my brother. To me, because I was the only one who ever asked him about it." Garrett crouched at the rear wheel arch, pressing his thumb against the rust to test the depth of it. Deeper than he'd hoped. Not as deep as he'd feared. Full restoration? Everything. "But I want it mechanically perfect first. Cosmetics second." She said it like someone who understood the order of priorities, which surprised him a little. "I was told you're the best in the region for air-cooled engines." He stood up. "Who told you that?" "Philip Chandler." She watched his face. He said, and I quote, "If Garrett Ward can't fix it, it can't be fixed." Philip Chandler was 78 years old and had been bringing him cars since Garrett was 26 and working out of a 2-bay rental in the next town over. The man's word carried weight. "It'll take time," Garrett said. 6 months minimum for a proper job. Maybe 8. "I'm not in a hurry. It'll cost." "I didn't ask about cost." He looked at her then, really looked, trying to figure out whether she understood what she was agreeing to, or whether she was the kind of person who said things like "I didn't ask about cost" without understanding what that actually meant. She held his gaze steadily. She had the particular stillness of someone used to being in rooms where other people did most of the talking. 40% up front, he said. "I'll give you a written estimate by Friday." She nodded once. "I'll need to see the progress monthly. You can call. I'd rather come in person." She glanced around the garage again. "If that's not a problem." He almost said it wasn't. Then from the doorway behind him came a voice. Dad, there's a fancy car in the driveway." His daughter Marisol was 8 years old and had her mother's directness and none of her mother's patience for social niceties. She was standing in the doorway between the garage and the back room that served as Garrett's office, still in her school clothes, backpack hanging off one shoulder, looking at the Bentley with the evaluating squint she normally reserved for math problems. "I see it," Garrett said. "Give me a minute." Marisol did not give him a minute. She walked into the garage, looked at Vivienne Ashworth with the same squint, and said, "Is that your car?" "The blue one? Yes. It's really blue, it is." Marisol considered this. "The old red one's nicer, even though it's broken." She looked at Garrett. "Dad, there's no snacks." "I checked the whole kitchen." "There's apples. Those don't count." Vivienne Ashworth made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, quickly suppressed. Garrett cut his eyes toward her without turning his head. "5 minutes," he said to Marisol. Marisol sighed with the full weight of her 8 years and went back through the door. Vivienne Ashworth was definitely smiling now, though she was trying not to. "She's yours?" "Since day one." He went back to looking at the Porsche. "Friday for the estimate. I'll need your contact information. I'll have my assistant send it over." She pulled a card from her jacket pocket, actual cardstock, heavy, embossed, and set it on his workbench next to the unopened court envelope. She glanced at the envelope briefly, didn't comment on it. "Thank you, Mr. Ward Garrett," he said. She was already walking back to the Bentley. "Garrett?" she said, without turning around. He opened the envelope that night after Marisol was in bed. It was from his late wife's parents, his in-laws, technically, or former in-laws. He was never sure what the right word was for the parents of someone who'd been gone for 2 years. The letter was from their attorney. It was about Marisol, about custody, about their belief, outlined in careful legal language, that a single father operating a sole proprietorship business out of a rural property did not represent a stable environment for a child of her needs. He read it twice. He folded it. He put it on the kitchen counter and washed his hands and stood at the sink for a while, looking at the dish rack. Marisol's small rubber duck sat on the edge of the sink. She was 8 too old for rubber ducks, but this one had been a gift from her mother, and she kept it there. She'd never explained why, and he'd never asked. He made himself a cup of coffee he didn't drink and went to bed. Vivienne Ashworth came the following Friday, not to check on the estimate, which he'd already sent to her assistant electronically, but apparently because she had questions about the original flat-six engine. "I want to understand what I'm paying for," she said, in a tone that made clear she actually meant it, not the way rich people sometimes said things like that, and then immediately deferred to whoever was considered the expert. He walked her through it. The engine displacement, the specific problems with early 911S models, the difficulty of sourcing period-correct parts without resorting to reproductions. She asked precise questions. She'd done research beforehand. Not a lot, but enough. She knew the difference between a 901 gearbox and a later unit. She knew the engine in this car was a 2.2-liter, not the later 2.4. She hadn't just Googled it the night before. She'd actually tried to understand. He found himself explaining more than he'd planned to. Marisol wandered in around 4, school day over, and immediately went to the corner where he kept a small stool for her and a bin of books, because she'd declared the back room boring and the garage interesting, even though she wasn't allowed near any of the lifts. She pulled out a chapter book and sat down without acknowledging either of them. "She's here every day after school?" Vivienne asked, quietly enough that only he could hear. "Until 6. I have Mrs. Calloway next door for emergencies, but Marisol prefers this." He considered. "She says the garage smells like something's always getting fixed." Something crossed Vivienne's face that he couldn't entirely read. "That's a good thing to think," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Yeah," he said. "It is." The pattern of her visits settled into a kind of rhythm he hadn't anticipated. First Friday of every month, always announced in advance by her assistant. Always 2 hours, always focused on the car. But she started arriving a few minutes before 2 and staying a few minutes after 4, and the extra time had a way of getting absorbed into conversation that wasn't about the Porsche. He learned. She'd built her first company from an inheritance she'd received at 23 and been told by 3 separate advisors to invest conservatively. She'd ignored them. The company had sold 6 years later for a figure he didn't ask about. Ashworth Innovations was the 4th company bearing her name. She'd grown up in a family that measured worth and visibility and she'd spent 30 years building things that proved worth could be measured differently. She learned he'd worked for an automotive engineering firm in Chicago before Keller Falls. Senior position, good salary, downtown apartment, the whole shape of a life that looked successful from the outside. He'd left it when his wife was first diagnosed, to move somewhere quieter, somewhere Marisol could have a yard and a slower pace. His wife had lived another 14 months. He'd stayed. "Do you miss Chicago?" Vivienne asked once, standing at his workbench while he documented the engine part numbers he'd sourced. "Sometimes," he said. "I miss the work, certain parts of it, the scale of the problems." He kept writing, "But Marisol's happy here. She knows her teachers. She knows the neighbors. She knows where the good climbing tree is." He paused. "That matters more than what I miss." Vivienne didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "My father told me something very similar once, about a decision he'd made. I didn't understand it at the time." Another pause. "I think I do now." In December, Marisol asked Vivienne if she knew how to braid hair. This was while Garrett was under the Porsche and couldn't immediately intervene. He heard the question and went very still, waiting. There was a brief silence. "I do," Vivienne said. "My dad's not good at it," Marisol said with total candor. "He does his best, but it comes out bumpy." "Marisol," Garrett said from under the car. "What?" "It's true." "It is true," Vivienne said, and something in her voice told him she was looking at the approximate location of his legs under the Porsche, with amusement he was currently unable to verify. "Would you like me to try?" The sound of Marisol's stools scraping across the floor told him the answer. He lay under the car for another 20 minutes, working. From a few feet away, he could hear the soft sound of Vivienne talking to Marisol. Not about anything important, not about anything he'd remember later, just the ordinary soft conversation of someone giving a small person their full attention. He kept his eyes on the chassis above him and his hands on the work, and didn't move until he was done with what he was doing. When he slid out, Marisol's hair was in two neat French braids. "Better than bumpy," Marisol informed him, pointing at her own head. "Significantly better," he agreed. Vivienne was washing her hands at the utility sink, her back to him, and he noticed she was more careful about it than someone who'd just been braiding hair needed to be. He thought he understood. She was giving him a moment to compose whatever his face was doing. He appreciated that more than he would have been able to say out loud. The custody letter led to a meeting with a family attorney in January, which led to paperwork, which led to Garrett spending several evenings at his kitchen table with documents spread across every surface, while Marisol did homework at the far end with elaborate, ostentatious concentration. Designed to make clear she wasn't listening. She was absolutely listening. One night she said, without looking up from her spelling worksheet, "Are Grandma and Grandpa going to take me away?" He set down his pen. "No," he said. "That's not going to happen. They want to. And they love you, and they don't understand that love and right aren't always the same thing." He paused, looking for the version of this she could understand. "They think a different kind of life would be better for you. I think they're wrong about that, and I'm going to show why they're wrong." She was quiet for a moment, pressing her pencil into her paper. "Are you scared?" He looked at her. 8 years old, face serious, pencil still. "A little," he said. "But being scared doesn't mean you can't also be sure. I'm very sure." She nodded slowly, like she was filing this information. Then she went back to her spelling. He picked up his pen. Vivienne came in February with a question that wasn't about the car and wasn't about their now habitual conversation. She sat down on the stool Marisol usually occupied. Marisol was at a birthday party, and she had the look of someone who has rehearsed something and is deciding whether to still say it. "I heard," she said, "about the custody situation." He kept his hands on what he was doing. "News travels. Philip Chandler mentioned it. He's worried about you." Philip Chandler worries about everyone. He's not wrong to worry about everyone. People need to be worried about sometimes. She turned the coffee mug on the workbench in a small circle, not looking at it. "I have a law firm I use. Family Division. They're very good, and I'd like to refer you if you'll let me." He stopped working. He looked at her. "I'm not offering to pay," she said quickly, as if she'd anticipated the objection. "I'm offering a referral. They do good work, and they know what they're doing with these situations." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" She met his eyes. "Because someone should." He thought about that answer for a long time, not what it meant as a statement of charity, which he didn't want and wouldn't take, but what it meant as a statement of something else. Something that had been building in the space between Friday visits and conversations about engines and French braids on a small girl's head. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said, and went back to not quite looking at the coffee mug. The referral led to a new attorney. The new attorney was a woman named Sylvester. Garrett assumed she'd heard every joke about the name and didn't make any of them, who read through the custody filing in front of him without expression and then said, "They don't have much. What they have is narrative, and narrative can be challenged." She challenged it, methodically, without drama, the way Garrett appreciated things being done. She documented his income, the stability of his business, Marisol's school records, her teacher's statements, her pediatrician's notes. She found 3 parents in similar situations in the county who provided character testimony. She was thorough in the way that made the other side's position look thin. He didn't win so much as the other side ran out of ground to stand on. The court date was in March. By noon it was done. He sat in his car in the courthouse parking lot for a while afterward. He'd expected to feel something cleaner, relief, maybe, or triumph. What he felt instead was something harder to name. A loosening of something he hadn't fully realized was clenched, a quiet. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of a room where you finally put down something heavy you'd been carrying, so long you'd stopped noticing the weight of it. He called Marisol's school and asked them to tell her he'd be picking her up himself today. Vivienne was not at his garage that week. She was at a conference in Boston, her assistant had mentioned. He found himself noting the absence the way you notice when a familiar sound stops. On Friday she came back. She walked in, took one look at his face and said, "Good news, I take it." "Yes." She nodded. She didn't say "I told you so" or "I'm so glad," or any of the things people said in these situations that were meant well but landed with a little too much performance. She just nodded, and the nod held everything it needed to hold. She walked to the Porsche. The bodywork was done now. The rust cut out and treated, the quarter panels repaired, the primer coat on, the color coat waiting for final polish. It was starting to look like what it had been. Guards red, bright and clear the way it had sat in a showroom in Stuttgart in 1971. She put her hand on the roof, not possessively, carefully. "It looks like his," she said. "I didn't think I'd remember what it looked like, but it looks like his." Garrett watched her hand on the roof. "There are some photographs from the early 70s, he said. "Your grandfather and the car. Philip Chandler found them in some old estate records. I have copies if you want them." She looked at him. "I was going to include them with the delivery," he said, "but I can give them to you now." She didn't say anything for a moment. When she did, her voice was steady, but only just. "I'd like that," she said. "Yes." He went to his office and came back with the envelope. She held it without opening it, both hands, and he understood that she'd open it somewhere private. He didn't push. 3 more weeks, he said. Maybe 4. Then she's done. Vivienne looked at the car for a long time. "I'm going to need to learn how to drive a manual," she said. "Don't tell me how hard it is. Just teach me." He almost said something about liability, about insurance, about the various reasons that was a complicated thing to offer at a business that existed in a small town with limited legal capacity to absorb complications. He said, "Okay." She looked at him sideways. A small expression, not quite a smile, not quite something else, something in between that he'd been cataloging for 6 months without quite deciding what to do with it. "That was easier than I expected," she said. "I've been told I can be reasonable occasionally." Philip Chandler said, relentlessly reasonable. Philip Chandler exaggerates. This time she did smile, and it was the kind that reached her eyes, the kind that changed the whole geography of a face. He looked at it for exactly 1 moment too long, and then looked back at the car, which was much safer. The car was done on a Thursday in early April. Marisol had declared herself the official inspector and walked around it 3 times with the same squint she'd used on the Bentley the first day, then declared it actually good, which was the highest available rating in her system. "Can I sit in it?" she asked. "Ask Miss Ashworth," Garrett said. "It's her car." Marisol turned to Vivienne with the squint now redirected. "Can I sit in it? Front or back?" Vivienne asked. "Front, obviously." Vivienne opened the door and Marisol climbed in with the gravity of someone taking possession of a throne. She put both hands on the steering wheel. She looked out through the newly replaced windshield at the garage, at the tools on the wall, at her father standing with his arms folded. "It smells like something just got fixed," she announced. Garrett looked at Vivienne. Vivienne looked at Garrett. "It does," Vivienne said. "It really does." He wasn't certain about things. He'd learned in the last 2 years that certainty was a particular kind of luxury, useful when you had it, worth examining when you thought you did. What he was certain about was this: the work had been good, the car was right, his daughter was safe, the garage was his. These were solid things. He'd stood on solid things before and understood how to balance. What was less solid, what he was still figuring out the weight of, was the particular feeling of watching someone drive his driveway in a dark blue Bentley and knowing, before they even parked, that the Friday was going to be different in a way he couldn't specify but could feel all the way to his hands. He mentioned this to no one. He thought about it anyway. Vivienne came back the following Friday, not because the car needed anything. The car was in her garage in the city now, waiting for a driving lesson she had scheduled with a patience he was learning was one of her most distinctive qualities. She came back because Marisol had left her spelling homework folder on the stool in the garage and had called Vivienne herself, very directly, at the number Vivienne had given her. Because, of course, she had the number. She'd asked for it in December with the same directness she applied to everything, and asked if she could bring it by. Vivienne brought it by. She handed the folder to Marisol, who said thank you with her school manners and then went back to her homework like this was entirely ordinary. Vivienne looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at Vivienne. The garage was quiet. Outside, late April, the first real warmth of the year had arrived and the window over the workbench was open for the first time since October. The air coming through smelled like the creek behind the property and new grass and the particular fresh machinery smell of a day when something was being properly started rather than repaired. "You drove 40 minutes each way," he said, "to return a homework folder." She leaned against the workbench. "Traffic was fine, Vivienne." She looked at him with that expression again, the one he'd been cataloging, the one he'd stopped trying to categorize 3 months ago, because every category he reached for was too small for it. "I like it here," she said. "I like the smell. I like the work." A pause. "I like the people." She said it simply, without performance, without the careful construction he'd seen her use, in conversations where something important was being managed. This was unmanaged. He recognized the difference because he'd been watching for it for 6 months, without knowing entirely that he was watching. "I have a daughter who adopts people without asking," he said. "I noticed. She's done it with Mrs. Calloway next door, the school librarian, the man who runs the hardware store. I noticed that too. She told me about them. She told you, at length." Something warm in Vivienne's voice, not performed, not social. "She's thorough." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the workbench, at his hands. No grease today. He'd been doing paperwork. His hands looked strange to him when they were clean. He'd never entirely gotten used to it. "Philip Chandler told me," he said, "when I first moved here, that Keller Falls was the kind of place that either took hold of you or didn't. He said you'd know pretty quickly which it was." "What did you find?" "Took hold," he said. "Immediately." Vivienne looked out the open window at the creek-colored afternoon. "He told me the same thing when I broke ground on the campus." She was quiet for a moment. "I thought he was being sentimental." "He usually is. He's usually also right." The afternoon settled around them. From the other room, muffled the sound of Marisol's pencil and the occasional quiet consultation of a dictionary. Outside, birds, the creek, the ordinary sounds of a place that had taken hold. "I'm not good at this," Garrett said. "Being careful about how I say things." "I'm very good at it," Vivienne said. "And it doesn't always serve me." She turned from the window. "So between the two of us, we might arrive somewhere reasonable." He looked at her. She looked at him. In the other room, Marisol said to no one in particular, "Dad, how do you spell necessary?" Garrett didn't look away from Vivienne. "Two C's," he said. "Once? Are you sure?" "I'm sure." A pause, pencil on paper. "Okay," Marisol said. "Thanks." Outside, the afternoon held still and warm. The gate to the gravel drive was open. It had been open since the morning, and he hadn't thought to close it. And now he thought he probably wouldn't bother. Some things you leave open because you've decided, without making a whole production of it, that whatever might come through deserves the room.